Good evening. Welcome to this first Advent study. We're talking about themes relating to incarnation. Incarnation is a word theologians use to talk about the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, taking on human flesh and being experienced through the person of Jesus Christ. So incarnation means something like God with skin on. Jesus is 100% God and 100% human, not a 50-50 blend. He is 100% of both. The Gospel of John says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." That's John 1:14. And the Message version says, "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood." So we are going to be looking at some of the implications of the incarnation during the Sundays of Advent. And I'm going to be looking at suffering. What is the implication for those of us who are suffering? What does the incarnation mean for us? I want to start by telling a story. So I had a philosophy of religion teacher in university. He described himself as a post-Shoah Jew and a pretty adamant atheist. The Shoah is another name for the Holocaust, and it is a word that means destruction or catastrophe. The word Holocaust means something like whole burnt sacrificial offering, and so it has a kind of religious connotation. So for him, the reality of he wanted to get away from that religious connotation. He just wanted it to be destruction and not have any of that kind of religious suggestion in it. So for him, the reality of the Shoah was proof that God either doesn't exist or isn't worthy of devotion. In class, he would sometimes sort of shake his fist at the ceiling at the God he said didn't exist, the God he didn't believe in. And to most of us, he seemed like he believed in God actually quite a bit, but mostly he seemed upset with God. For a time, unusually, he had been married to an Anglican priest. And she once told him a kind of parable about the gospel that came from a feminist theologian. I don't know the actual source for this, but it has always stuck with me. And he said that as a Jew, there never really was anything that attracted him to Christianity. It was always kind of like a non-issue. There was no sort of temptation to come over to Christianity for him. But this one story had an effect on him, and I wanted to share that story with you today. So this story is about a little girl and her mother, and it was a big day for them. They were going to a fancy wedding later, and they both had gotten new dresses for the occasion. It was still early in the day, but the little girl couldn't stop thinking about the wedding and her special dress that she was going to wear. She would run into the house from the backyard periodically and ask her mother, "Is it time to go to the party yet?" And her mother would reply, "No, no, not until later today, dear." So the little girl would go back outside to play, and children don't always have a good sense of time. And so over and over, she would run back in and up to her mother and ask if it was time to go to the party yet. Well, her mother would reply, "Not yet." Over and over, the little girl ran to her mother and repeat her question, and the mother would repeat her answer, "No, not yet, dear. Just wait, just wait. I'll tell you when it's time. I'll tell you when it's time." And she'd keep running up and saying, "Is it time yet? Is it time yet?" And they played this game the way that kids often do. And once again, the little girl thought that it must be getting closer to the time for the wedding and thought that perhaps she would finally be allowed to wear her dress. And her mother replied, "I don't think that's a good idea. You might get it dirty before the wedding." But the little girl begged, "Please, Mom, can I put on my dress? I won't get it dirty, I promise." Well, the mother gave in to the girl's pleading, and the girl was allowed to put her dress on the condition that she would promise not to get it dirty. Her dress was pink with lace, and it was beautifully poofy. She put her dress on and marched outside very pleased, and she began playing very carefully. But eventually, she became wrapped up in her play and wasn't as careful as she should have been. As she was playing, She tripped and she fell in a mud puddle. Mud was all over her new white, pink, lacy, poofy dress. There she was, sitting in the mud in her brand new dress. Just then, her mother walked out the back door. Her makeup was on, her hair was beautiful, she was wearing lovely jewelry, and she was wearing her wonderful new dress. It was time to leave for the wedding. The girl looked up at her mother and then down at her muddy white dress, her pink, poofy, lacy dress, and she burst into tears. She remembered her promise. She couldn't stand to even look her mother in the face. She knew she was in trouble. She sat in the mud puddle, her face in her hands, and she cried. The mother slowly walked over to the little girl in her fancy new dress, and she sat in the mud right beside her little girl. And shocked, the little girl looked up into her mother's smiling face with tears in her eyes. They were both filthy, and they both started laughing. Well, this is an image of the Incarnation. It's not the only image we can use. Sometimes we might want to use a child laid in an animal's feeding trough. It's also a pretty messy image, but it's a helpful image. God does not abandon us in the mess of our lives. We can sometimes feel like that little girl. We have broken our promises. We have done things we shouldn't have done. We haven't done things we should have done. Sometimes the mess isn't of our making, but we just face incredible suffering just because of the chaos of the world, because of things that other people do to us, because of things that just happen to us. Often we feel like we're living in a mess. And we can naturally be left feeling like God is going to be very upset with us, or we feel like God is very distant and doesn't care about what we're going through. Kind of like the mother standing off at the doorway with her beautiful dress on, looking down on us in the mud, off in the distance. And the mess is actually a mess. It's not that the mess is an illusion or anything. The sin is real. The mess is real. We shouldn't have done those things. The suffering we experience is real. That's not an illusion. It's real and it matters. But the Incarnation, God's coming to us as one of us, means God has entered the mess with us. We are not abandoned by God in our mess. In love, God joins us in our mess so that he can help us out of it. So this is an image I want you to sort of keep in your mind as we go through the rest of what I want to talk about tonight. That image of the little girl in the mud, us in that mess. We are the little girl, and our mother coming out the door, ready, beautifully ordained, or beautifully decorated, dressed up, ready to go to the party, and the interaction of the mother coming into the mud with the little girl. I also want to use an image that doesn't feel very Adventy or very Christmassy. This is the Isenheim altarpiece. It's an altarpiece sculpted by Nicholas of Haguenau and painted by Matthias Grunewald. And they're both obviously, I believe, Germans, and the work dates to 1512 to 1516. It was painted for the monastery of St. Anthony, which specialized in hospital work. So imagine this, sick people looking at this image. The image is meant to show patients that Jesus understood and shared their afflictions, that he suffered with them. The wings were usually closed, and on the closed wings we see the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, And on the right, we see Saint Anthony the Great being taunted by a demon. You can kind of see up in the right-hand corner there. It's hard to see, but sort of being taunted by a demon. And both saints were important patrons for those who were sick, and they were patrons that dealt especially with um, people would pray for their intercession for specific illnesses that they were dealing with. In the main image, Mary, Jesus' mother, is shown on the right of Jesus, falling into the arms of John. And Mary Magdalene is also there, kneeling in prayer. On the left of Jesus is John the Baptist with a lamb, symbolizing Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And I want you to sort of take a look at Jesus's feet here as well. It's a pretty intense image there. There's a lot of symbolism in this picture. There are also sculptures that are a part of this altarpiece as well. And I won't kind of go into these too much here. There are also images of Anthony visiting St. Paul the Hermit in the desert. And St. Anthony is also shown tormented by demons. Angels are also being sent to battle with the demons. And you can see him meeting with St. Paul on the left and the demons tormenting him on the right. And there are four scenes on the inside of the wings, which were opened for festivals. We see the Archangel Gabriel announcing to Mary that she'll give birth to Jesus. And we also see the Christ child in Mary's arms, along with a choir of angels. And on the right wing, we see the resurrection. Christ emerges from the tomb and ascends into heaven, showing that Christ has conquered sin and death. And you can see the Pieta at the very bottom, Jesus, his dead body, his mother holding him. But what I really want to focus on here is the central image, the crucifixion. Grunwald's crucifixion expresses incredible agony. Christ's body is emaciated. You can see his hands are twisted from the nails driven through them. His body is covered with sores. His head has thorns being pushed down onto his scalp. It's an image of incredible suffering. To the sick who prayed before this image, they were made aware that Christ suffers with them. In their suffering, they had a kind of communion with Christ. And when I look at this image, I think a little bit of uh, the movie, The Passion of the Christ. And I know a lot of us were sort of bothered by that movie. There were a lot of people who felt like it maybe glorified the violence of it, but I sort of wonder, for someone who has been beaten that badly, I wonder if they would watch that movie differently. When I was 19, I was jumped by 9 or 10 guys, and uh, I was beaten up really badly. Like I, so the idea of soldiers kicking you, um, jumping on you, that is not a completely foreign image to me. So I wonder if maybe because in the West, and maybe we are sort of sheltered from a lot of violence, I wonder if we see that movie differently because of our sheltering. So this image of the crucifixion, I know there's a kind of a grotesqueness to it, but I wonder if there isn't something special about it because those who were looking at it were suffering in significant ways. This was kind of a hospital monastery, and there were people who were incredibly sick, suffering in incredible ways, looking upon this image that brought forward in a very graphic way the pain of the crucifixion, that intense agony. When Christ took on human life, he took on a life that would be marked by suffering, a very particular, public, shameful, and agonizing kind of suffering. The word excruciating actually means from the cross, ex crucio, right? And it's not, in a way, I want the cross to also be symbolic of the rest of his life as well, because he's also somebody who had to become a refugee early on. So his parents had to flee with him, to flee Herod. Um, he knows what it was like to be betrayed by the religious establishment, his own leadership that betrayed him. He knew what it was like to be sort of brought along through a kind of for people to use the criminal justice system against him in a way that was not fair. He knows what it was like for a friend to betray. One of his closest friends betrayed him into this mess. So the crucifixion, I don't want you to just think about the crucifixion as being that particular moment, but I want you to think of the crucifixion also as representing all the suffering that he endured in his life. So the incarnation was not about entering into a life that was free from suffering or even as free from suffering as possible. He seemed to enter into a life that was very particularly a life of suffering. I think it's also important for us to recognize that crucifixion itself is not extraordinary. There are plenty of people who have been crucified, and I just want to mention a few of these. There was a slave rebellion between 73 and 71 BC called the Third Servile War, and about 120,000 rebel slaves were led by a man named Spartacus in revolt against the Roman Republic. And this led to about 6,000 of his followers being crucified along a 200-kilometer stretch of road between Capua and Rome as a warning to those who would oppose Rome's power. And so just to help you visualize that a little bit, Red Deer to the center of Calgary is 147 kilometers. Ponoka to downtown Calgary is 200 kilometers. So if you could kind of divide 6,000 by 200 kilometers, you kind of imagine every telephone pole is a crucified slave. Josephus tells us that after the death of King Herod in 4 BC, there were revolts which were put down by Rome. And this led to the crucifixion of 2,000 people. And this was another warning to those who would oppose Rome's power. Judas the Galilean led a revolt in the year 6 AD over that issue of taxes being given to Rome. Judas's 3 sons were crucified, and yet again another warning against opposing Rome. Josephus also tells us that during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, many were crucified before the walls of Jerusalem to terrorize those inside, to get them to surrender the city. And Josephus says that they crucified 500 people a day until they ran out of wood for making crosses. So the message is clear. Do not oppose the power of Rome. And most of these people we don't have any names for. They join the masses of people throughout the ages that have come up against the powers of this world and have lost. They join those in unmarked mass graves. They join the masses who were murdered at the hands of the Nazis and under the reigns of Pol Pot and Stalin and many others throughout the centuries that have terrorized humanity. And to the powers of the day, Jesus was a nobody, just like the rest of them. It was expected that he would disappear into the nameless grave the way so many others have before him. And so Jesus stands before Pilate. Pilate sees before him a poor and possibly demented man. And when asked questions, he gives vague and mysterious answers. In the Roman worldview of the day, there was a hierarchy of persons from the highest gods to the lowest slave. And the lowest slave was more a thing than a person to those Romans. Pilate is a bit nearer to the heavens. He has the power of Rome flowing through his will. In Pilate's worldview, Jesus is in a particularly low place. Jesus has no claim on Pilate's mercy. He can't claim any rights, any freedoms that are owed him. Pilate has complete sway over his life or death, according to Pilate in the Roman worldview. Jesus is scourged and mockingly dressed in a cloak with a crown of thorns pressed onto his scalp by bored soldiers. He stands before Pilate, having been humiliated, and then receives the news that he is to be crucified. The theologian and historian David Bentley Hart says this: in the order of the ancient world, Pilate's verdict is essentially a just one, not because the penalty it imposes is somehow proportionate to the crime, but because it affirms the natural and divine order of reality by consigning a worthless man to an appropriately undignified death, and by restoring order through the destruction of the agent of disorder. For in the end, the gods love order above all else. So to Pilate, Christ is just causing disorder, and Pilate is restoring that order. In the second chapter of Philippians, Paul quotes an ancient hymn of the early church, and many think that he is quoting a hymn and not writing this from scratch. Christ, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be exploited, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. So here we have someone being in the very nature God, submitting himself as a servant and going to death on the cross. This is something he chose, in a sense. We are told that God became human, but not an emperor or a king, a child born to a young unwedded woman and laid in an animal's feeding trough. He was born into poverty, and he would be forced to be a refugee as his family fled a brutal tyrant. God was born into a family that would have disappeared into the mists of time with many other unnamed and forgotten families. God became one of the nameless ones. God became one of the petals resting on the surface of the water, powerless against the waves and the ripples. He became one of the powerless people. Jesus stands before Pilate, a representative of the greatest power of the day, the Roman Empire. And the cry of Jesus will be the cry of the abandoned and rejected nobodies of the world. My God, why have you forsaken me? And God in his humanity will feel abandoned by himself, whatever that can mean. His cry is Job's cry. My God, why have you forsaken me? It is a very particularly human kind of suffering. We can suffer all kinds of physical and mental pain if we feel God is with us, that there is hope, that our suffering isn't pointless. But to feel abandoned by God is to feel a kind of suffering that is hopeless and meaningless. Not only did Jesus become one of the nobodies, he also took on those parts of us that we don't want to let into the light. The dark, selfish, slithering, hissing, corrupted parts of us. In Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he says, for our sake, God made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. God made him to be sin. 2 Corinthians 5:21. Jesus came to us as one of the powerless. He emptied himself that he could be filled with our violence and our corruption. If Christ was to absorb the evil and corrupt powers that influence this world, he could not be a bearer of those powers, though. It would not do to be an emperor. As soon as he plays on their terms with their powers of violence, then he's lost. Jesus is to have those powers used against him, to be a recipient of them, the way that the majority of humankind has been. He joins the nameless and the faceless masses to endure the power of sin and death that have been oppressing them since before anyone can remember. Reflecting on the Incarnation and how it led Christ to the cross, I'm brought to the thought that God has not abandoned us in our suffering. Even as we are not given a satisfactory explanation for our suffering, he has joined us in our suffering. God does not sit off in the distance watching us suffer. He joins us in all the filth, in the dust and the ashes. No satisfactory and conclusive explanation is given. But God came to sit with us in our mess. But he will not leave us there. God will not let suffering have the last word in God's good creation. Jesus will be with us. He will descend into the grave with us, and he will rise with us. Jesus sits with us in our pain and our suffering, but he's there to guide us out of our suffering as well. He's there on the other side of our suffering. Life does not end with a cross. God will not let life end with a cross. The cross will lead to resurrection and life that does not end. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." So I have a few questions for us to reflect on. And I'm not sure how we want to organize this, but I think maybe what we'll do is we'll just have, I think we're planning on having a discussion as one big group. And so I think the questions that come to mind for me, and you can use other questions or other comments that you might have, but these are the questions that I'm sort of interested in based on what I was talking about. So when you are suffering, does God feel closer or further away from you? And why do you think that is? When you are suffering, how do you feel about God? What kinds of things do you say to God? And do these thoughts about incarnation into a life of suffering change how you relate to God in your own suffering? So maybe we can stop here and have a bit of a discussion, and I'll just stop talking for a bit here.